So thank you everyone for joining us today for Janet Rafner's presentation, Hybrid Intelligence and Human AI Co-Creativity. Janet Rafner is a research fellow at Aarhus, I hope I said that right, Institute for Advanced Studies, and is the junior center director for the Center for Hybrid Intelligence at Aarhus University. She holds a PhD in information communication technology, and her current research focuses on citizen science, participatory futures, psychometric creativity assessment, computational co-creativity, and human AI interaction. She is a Salzburg Global Fellow and a former U.S. Fulbright Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Janet. All right, Janet, it's all yours.
Okay, great. I will share my screen now and get going. So first, thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. It looks like we're going to be a cozy group for the next hour and a half. So if you have questions, please write them in the chat or the Q&A. And I hope that you find this talk informative. It's certainly a very timely topic now. And there are a lot of concepts that I'm going to be covering today, but I do my best with lots of examples and lots of metaphors for concepts in AI and also in particularly in human AI co-creativity. So just before I get going, so you know who it is, apart from the wonderful introduction. I'm from the United States, so I did my my bachelor's at the University of Virginia. I have degrees in physics, and then I have a minor in studio art. So from the beginning, I was also a bit interdisciplinary. I moved to Denmark in 2015 on a US Fulbright Fellowship to study how complex phenomena is conveyed visually. So that was my next attempt at trying to bridge between my interest in physics and my interest in art. And then I decided to stay on stay here in Denmark for my master's, which I did at the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen, which is technically in physics, my master's, but I worked a lot in citizen science and games, and particularly looking at how humans solve problems and how our algorithms solve problems. So designing games in order to understand the human problem-solving aspect, and then using various types of algorithms to approach an algorithmic problem-solving aspect. And then I finished my PhD last year at Aarhus University in information communication technology. And the work was really split between, on one hand, a focus on human-computer interaction, specifically human AI interaction and the literature base there, and then also in psychology and cognitive science. So focusing on the concept of creativity from a psychology and cognitive science perspective. And right now, I have two affiliations. As I said, I'm the junior center director for the Center for Hybrid Intelligence, which is a group. It's the office I'm in right now. We're a big group addressing this hybrid intelligence or human-centered AI from many different perspectives. And I'm also a research fellow at our Institute for Advanced Studies, specifically working on a project on human AI co-creativity. So an overview for today. I'll start with an introduction to what is hybrid intelligence and human AI co-creativity with some definitions and examples and put it in context. And then I'll talk about three different projects. The first project is on understanding and assessing human creativity via an AI-enhanced game-based portfolio. So that project is looking at this human AI co-creativity from that psychology and psychometrics perspective. Then the second project is called Facilitating Creative Problem Solving on Complex Socio-Scientific Issues via an AI-enhanced game-based platform. So that's taking a lot of these insights that we've gained also from Project One on how humans and AI interact in creative settings, and looking at a very not looking at a closed experiment that you might have, a laboratory experiment that you might have in psychology, but rather a very open, ecologically valid approach, going out into the public and engaging with them and seeing what they can do with this technology. And then the last project is the investigating the adoption of human AI co-creative technologies by creative professionals. So that's saying, okay, now what about our architects? What about our engineers and our designers? How are they using and incorporating these technologies? And the reason why I want to show you these 3 projects is because human AI co-creativity is such a broad field. If I only presented one, you may come away thinking that that's the only area where it's applicable. But I hope that with these 3 different projects, you'll have a good sense of the variety of circumstances in which human AI co-creativity and hybrid intelligence is relevant. So I have a couple of questions, just intro questions that if you would like, I would be happy to hear your perspectives on in the chat. I'll just give you a moment if you want to answer. So just to get a sense of who's in the room also, I would ask, maybe you can write in a couple of words, what is AI or what is it for you? So that can be a technical definition. It can also be an impression that you have about it. It can be hope or fear. So acceptable to say technology, I'm afraid, is taking my job, or a more technical definition is also okay. So just curious if anyone can write in the chat. Great. So we have, I'll just read out a few. Machines acting like humans. Yeah. AI is an emerging tool to enhance tasks. A powerful tool, potential collaborator. Scary. Yes. I'm committed to leveraging AI for education, teaching, and learning. AI is yet another term abused by media. Yes, I agree with many of this. Make an impact on art and education. Absolutely. That's great to hear a little bit about what your interests are. Next question. Do you think AI can be creative? You can do yes or no, or you can elaborate as well. Yes, we have one that's a yes, it's subjectively true. Not sure. Yeah, please define creative. Yeah, good answer. With human input. All very nice. Okay, next question. How would you evaluate if AI is creative? Are there any thoughts on how that would happen? Coming up with original ideas. How are the new ideas approached? Input from humans, develop a truly unique solution, making art, compared to whatever was defined as creativity. Very nice, thank you. And the last question we have. Do you think AI support will make humans more or less creative? Both? Less? Well, if you had any difficulty answering these questions or were uncertain about it, you are not alone. This is a huge research topic now, and specifically since the launch of ChatGPT and other models, the field of AI in creativity has just exploded, as you can see on the screen now, not just in media, not just in conversations and tool development, but also in research practices. And there are a lot of very provocative headlines too, such as this one here: artificial intelligence is more creative than humans, cognitive perspective on current state-of-the-art generative language models. Some of them are more nuanced, redefining creativity in the era of AI, perspectives of computer scientists and new media artists. But the point is that researchers don't have a good answer to this question, or really to many of these questions. It depends on how you define creativity. It depends on your approach. And there are a lot of nuances that often get missed in the mainstream media, and actually even some of these research papers as well. So I hope that in this talk, that at least by the end, you will have a better grasp on what the different perspectives are on human AI creativity, what are some maybe more interesting questions to ask other than, is AI creative? And you may even reflect on your own practices on how you could experiment with AI in your day-to-day life. So just because I don't know who is in the audience so well, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'll do a brief introduction on AI now. So artificial intelligence is defined as, or one way of defining it, as a computational system that can perform tasks traditionally associated with human intelligence, such as learning, reasoning, and problem solving. AI research is not new. It started in the 1950s. Some argue the 1940s, depends on which camp you're in. But the general message is that it's been around for a while. It's only now just becoming mainstream and engaging researchers in many, many different fields because of the open accessibility of these, and a really impressive work that can come from generative technologies. Then generative AI is a type of artificial intelligence that focuses on creating new content, such as images, music, or text, by learning patterns and structures from existing data. So generative models, and most of the AI, the term that I'll use today, is really referring to generative models. I'll go into a little bit of detail about a couple of types of models, but I'll generally refer to it either as AI or generative model. And you can see here, it's one form of AI, one form of machine learning or of neural networks. And so this is really a hierarchy. And this is a non-comprehensive view of AI. There are many different fields, but just to show you a little bit on the breakdown. And some examples of generative AI, I think most of you will have heard of them. ChatGPT, OpenAI, with its image generation, as well Dall-E 2, Midjourney is also image generation, etc. So, and again, please feel free to write in the chat if there's an unfamiliar term, or you need me to go into more details into something. So, before we start, this is not a lecture on data security with AI, or on the environmental impact of AI, or these various things. They're important topics, but I'm covering a lot, but I really can't cover all of it in 90 minutes. I just want to mention that it is important whenever you are interacting with a form of generative AI in general also, to be aware of your data and to be aware of your input and your control over that or lack thereof. Many companies have banned ChatGPT. You can see here the list, because of fear that a real fear that the data used will compromise personal information, or will reduce advantages in their companies. For example, if Amazon employees are putting in their data sets to ChatGPT, then ChatGPT gets access to those to that information as well. There are some rules out there now, or some options where you can, as I say here, turn off your chat history, but I'm skeptical as to how protected the data is. So keep that in mind in any cases using AI, in particular generative models. Okay, so generative AI, where are we now? Why suddenly is there this big burst in everything? Well, it didn't just happen overnight, but it's really a combination of enhancements in many different areas. So going from handwriting recognition, speech recognition, image recognition, you can see we all they reached a critical point here in 2020. So it's important to think of this as iterative work that culminated together. It's also still coming out on a day-to-day basis, new technologies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this particular website. It's one that I like. It's called There's an AI for That. I haven't updated it since October, but it shows on a day-to-day basis, minute by minute, actually when new technologies are coming out or when they're posted, and they have thousands. Here you can see this was 8,000 something AIs for various tasks and X jobs. They had 153 come out in July. They seem to be stabilizing at the end of the month, somewhere between 50 and 100 new programs that are using AI every month. So if you want to keep up and see the wide variety, this is one website that I'd recommend. So I mentioned also my headline, I'm talking about this concept of hybrid intelligence. And that term may be unfamiliar to many of you. So I just want to describe it briefly in comparison to artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence is a piece of code. So I defined it earlier as this model, but really think of it as a piece of code. And there are many benefits from it, but there are also lots of potential failures of using artificial intelligence. So to deliver value, employee de-skilling, disruption for bigger companies with more data. And on the other hand, we have an area of research that's called hybrid intelligence, which is more than code. It is a human AI process, both at an individual level and at an organizational level, that's designed to integrate stakeholders, upskill, empower employees, innovate, and have more value generation. So this is not also just buzzwords here, but it's really focused on augmenting the human both in the algorithms used, the interface, so the human AI interaction, as well as the whole dialogue around how this technology should be used. And a key principle with hybrid intelligence is the concept of mutual learning, where the human is progressively learning over time, as well as the algorithm. So both of them are improving over time through their shared collaboration. Yes, just a brief example also from industry. Not sure how many people here that's relevant for, but for example, in a BCG study in 2020, they reported only 1 in 10 companies have significant financial benefits from implementing AI. The single most critical driver of value from AI is not algorithms nor technology, it's the human in the equation. When AI initiatives focus on between interaction and feedback between humans and AI, they're 6 times more likely to amplify the success. I'm also happy to share that article later. It's here. Often people may say, I'm afraid of AI taking my job. My comment is generally back to that. AI won't take your job. A person who knows how to use AI efficiently and in a hybrid intelligent way may take your job if you don't learn how to use it in that efficient way as well. So just another comment on this of bringing humans more and more into the loop of processes. You can imagine it's sort of this V diagram. On one side of the diagram, you have algorithms, nearly all of them today, which involve the human in some component. And that's what we call human in the loop artificial intelligence. So then in this one direction shown here, you have moving the human out of the loop. See the little guy is there. No, he's on the loop. And then in the farthest, in the V diagram, the human is out of the loop. So that would be autonomous operation where the human is not involved at all. There are risks to these. I mentioned them briefly before. I mentioned them again now, such as bias amplification, de-skilling. So that's when you lose a skill that you may have had previously or fail to acquire a new skill that you really should. because you are over-reliant on a technology. Not just AI, but deskilling is a broad concept for many different types of technology. There's also this concept of perverse instantiation and value alignment. So that's when the human's values are not appropriately aligned with what the human has programmed the algorithm to have as values. There are all these problems, but there is a disruptive potential which can be good, which can really mix things up and bring us a lot of progress. However, on the other side, really coming from the human-centered AI community, you have this concept from the human-computer interaction community, you have this concept called human-centered AI. And the premise in HCI, in particular human-centered AI, is AI as a tool for human augmentation, pursuing simultaneously high degrees of automation and human control. And I think that's really important, this point here. So you want to automate what you can, as much as you can, while maintaining control from the human. An example at the bottom, it's not a creativity example, but I think it's a nice example, a pain control system. So on a high level of computer automation, but very low human control, you have automated dispenser. And then if you have low computer automation, but high control, you have a patient-guided dispenser. And then there are these different areas, which different possibilities for each one. So now I've talked about the human-centered AI and autonomous AI, or the path towards it. Hybrid intelligence in this area, I and at our center, we define it as falling a bit into the middle, where we don't see the algorithms only as tools, but also as some wrote in the chat, potential for partners if done correctly, trying to find these optimal synergies, and a big focus on this concept of mutual learning. Okay, so when and why is hybrid intelligence needed? I should say it's not needed everywhere. This is not to say every situation in which an algorithm or some form of machine learning model is applied, you need to have hybrid intelligence. But there are many circumstances in which it is needed. So in particular, in my research, I focus on learning of soft skills, so artistic, creativity, flexibility, imaginative, intuition, and sensibility. And so that's the direction that we're going to be going in for the rest of the talk. But I really wanted to make sure that everyone was somewhat on the same page with regards to the various types of AI and how we'll be discussing them. So to creativity now. Creativity is actually a science. For a long time, it has been considered as mysterious workings of the gods, or just something that happens that you can't really put words to or put a feeling to. But it actually, modern science does consider creativity to be the result of measurable psychological processes. Creativity is studied in many different fields. This area specifically I'm talking about comes from psychology, but there's also, design has a different approach, aesthetics has a different approach, innovation and entrepreneurship, they have a different approach. In particular here, I'm speaking from a psychology perspective. So how is creativity defined? Very broadly, it's defined as something which is novel and useful. Novel could be original, unique, unusual compared to others, statistically rare, and useful is appropriate, workable, effective, satisfying, adaptive in a particular contexts. There's also in the creativity research, there's quite a bit on the element of surprise. How does that affect creativity? But this is more or less the standard definition. It is, of course, much more nuanced, which we'll get into. One way of addressing these types of nuances is to look at a couple of frameworks, one of which is called, sometimes it's called the 2 C's, sometimes it's called the 4 C's. Everyone wants to put in a new level there, that divides creativity into big creativity. So that's almost close to what you would think of as creative genius. So eminence, world-class accomplishments, high impact, culturally significant work. That culturally significant is a big aspect. So when you create something, you as general, when someone creates something, be it art, literature, science, that is considered to be culturally significant by peers in that particular field. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have little c creativity. So that's everyday creativity, hobbies, jokes, quips, actions, something that's new for you and not new for the world at large. And that's a really important distinction to make. Also, and especially when we're talking about AI, say if can AI be creative? Well, can generative AI learn from a large corpus of text and then create a joke that has never been said before? Yeah, but the question is then, so what? So what does that mean for us in our society? What does it mean for me individually? This, for example, this little c creativity is off little c, and then they do have a lower level called mini c, is often very much associated with learning, individual learning, and how this creativity, this aspect of creativity is important in development, both at a childhood and adult level. And so in that case, it's very much focused on the individual and how they are improving over time, or how they experience openness to new experiences and other types of phenomena, and is less relevant for example, their professional career, in the sense of, are they creating an artifact that is then recognized as creative? Another very valuable perspective to take on creativity are the 4 Ps, which divides it out into a product, a person, a process, and what they call press. They were just looking for an extra P there. It's really more about the environment. And so in relationship to concepts about AI and creativity, one is the outcome. So looking at a piece of music or a new recipe or whatnot that has been created either by or in conjunction with an artificial intelligence. And then the other, a big component is trying to understand the process. So understanding those intentions and external factors. The intentions specifically is something that our algorithms don't have. They're not intending to do one thing or not. They don't know what the user's intentions are. They only read from the input to the output. So hopefully that's a little bit more information on how you could understand and expand on questions like, can AI be creative? Can it support me in its creativity? That leads to the next point here. So creativity is typically written out as one of the top skills needed for the 20th century, for 21st century, for each year it's evaluated. In this case, I think this was OECD. No, this was World Economic Forum. A big question now is whether or not creativity and co-creativity are the same thing. So, and by same thing, I mean same processes that happen in the brain. So are humans that engage in traditional creative activities, is their brain working in a similar way when they're working with an algorithm? Does it compare more to an individual process or a team process? Will it be creativity still that is this important quality, or will it be co-creativity? So knowing how to appropriately create alongside or in tandem with artificial intelligence. That's a big question. We don't know the answer to it yet. Leading into this digital creative interaction, this is one of my favorite figures by Karimi et al. It breaks down types of digital creative interaction into these 3 categories. You have the first one, which is creative support tools. So that does not have to involve an AI at all. That's, I mean, you imagine the old version of GarageBand. You think of even a Google Doc, something. Now all these things are incorporating AI now, but you imagine the pre-AI phase. So that's something, a tool that's built to support users' creativity. Then you have computational creativity. So that's very specific, where it's AI or computer science researchers that are creating algorithms, that then those algorithms make creative outputs. I had to put creative in quotation marks, so outputs that could be considered creative if a human had made them. And then the last category is this computational co-creativity. So that's HCI, human-computer interaction, and AI researchers developing tools to support co-creation. And I put this next slide in here just to get a little bit about what can be involved in the co-creation process. So creativity, as I said, okay, you have this, can generally be defined as novel and valuable things, ideas, objects, products, but creative tasks and the process is quite complex. And it's important to not just sort of lump everything together and say creative process. There are many different components of it. So here's just an example from Ben Schneiderman on, he breaks it down into collecting information, relating information, creating, and then donating, which is the dissemination of results. And then even further breaking down to search, visualization, consulting with peers, thinking freely, thinking by free associations, exploring solutions, etc. And then from the AI side, I see I've missed the reference here, but there's a very cool book, I think it's actually called Prediction and Judgment, that breaks down tasks into exactly that. Tasks that require prediction and tasks that require judgment. And the tasks that require prediction are much more likely to be taken over or significantly enhanced by AI than the tasks that require judgment. So also when dividing up or looking at various aspects of the creative process, it's also important to consider, is this part of the process a prediction task? So is it something that it can learn from a large amount of data and then make a pretty good judgment as to what the result is? Or is it a judgment? So actually having to make that decision. Okay, so now I have, in the first half an hour, talked about lots of different concepts. And I just will take a brief moment here to pause and see, are there any critical questions on the background? I'm going into now examples in each of these categories, which may or will likely answer some of your questions. But I just want to make sure that no one is lost. Just give it a second here. Okay, so I will go ahead and move on then. But again, please feel free to write something in the chat. So now, in this first project, I'm focusing very much on the psychology side and the psychometric side. So focusing in particularly on assessment and assessment of specific processes. So convergent and divergent thinking, which are two very common processes in creativity. So convergent thinking can very, divergent thinking can very broadly be considered as exploring lots of possibilities. And it's generally considered this ideation, brainstorming, generation phase, and is evaluated by looking at 4 main factors. So you have fluency, that is the sheer number of responses one can produce. You have flexibility, so how different those responses are from each other, from your own responses. Then you have originality, so how original is your response compared to a pool of responses. For example, everyone on this call, if you're given a prompt, then you would look at how common my response is compared to the rest of you. And then last is elaboration, or how much detail has been put into the response. Then you have the phase of convergent thinking. which is deciding what to do. And in convergent thinking and psychometric assessment is a hotly debated topic because none of the methods for assessing it are that good. However, it broadly refers to selecting from a pool of possibilities what is the best path forward. Some argue that that there has to be one definitive answer, yes or no. Some argue that it's the best out of the possibilities, or that could be argued as the best out of the possibilities, but it's generally seen as this convergent phase. So how is this generally measured? Well, okay, sorry, stepping back, just to say that this type of assessment of creativity is focused on the individual. So this is focused on me and my cognitive processes. And a use case for assessing this would be, for example, you have a creativity course at the university, and you want to evaluate its impact on a particular, on your students. So you may give them this test in the beginning of the course, and then a test here you'll see with a different object or different prompt at the end of the course. It's also used then often in conjunction with various, what is the word for it? Personality tests, as well as openness to experience. They tend to correlate quite well. And also divergent thinking tests, although there are some problems with them, which I'll talk about, they do they have a, they are shown to predict creative potential in the future. So very briefly, the typical test is name as many uses, creative different uses of a brick as possible. So example here, build a house, use it as a doorstop, use it as an exfoliator, grind it to make a filtering substance, whatnot. So you can see here the fluency would be 4. This could be seen as 1 or, let's see, 1, 2, 3 different categories, 3 or 4, depending on if you put 1 and 2 in the same category. And then I can't look at originality because I don't know what it's compared to at this point, but it would be a comparison between these results and someone else's. Then elaboration could be defined as number of words, also in drawings, how elaborate the drawing is, which is sometimes just how much ink is used. Exactly. So here, another type of test for this figural aspect is pictures, and then you have to fill them in with various things. For convergent thinking, the main test is it's called, abbreviated as the RAT. I don't know if you're familiar with it, the Remote Associates Task. And it is a word association, a test where you're asked to take 3 items, for example, cottage, Swiss, and cake, and write what you think the word is that ties them together. In this case, the correct answer is cheese. Yeah, that's a bit, and this, if you're sitting there thinking, how is that a creativity test? Join the club. we as creativity researchers are always a little bit skeptical about using this particular assessment mechanism, but broadly, there really aren't any other tests that are widely used to assess convergent thinking. So, what are researchers saying about this? What are the problems? Well, James Kaufman is a very prominent creativity researcher in Connecticut. He wrote this paper last year with 2 other very prominent creativity researchers, highlighting that there are advances in divergent thinking that are exciting, like gamified, stealth assessment methods, internet technologies, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. This was a call to action last year, more or less, August of last year. And my response previously in projects they've been working on, and now as well, is the need for this combination between the psychometrics and psychology and this human-computer interaction. Because these tests that I showed you before have been around since the 1950s. And we have much, much more sophisticated ways of engaging with creative behavior than these pen and paper tests. So how can AI, and also in my research case using games, how can they be used to help solve some of these issues with standard tests? Well, on one hand, they can be visual versus language based, so they're not reliant on someone's vocabulary. They are more casual, natural, and immersive, so you can combat things like testing anxiety, which really is a problem when you're trying to look at someone's creative behavior. You don't want them to be really anxious that they're being tested. And then lastly, fine-grained metrics for assessing creative products and processes. So if you saw these two tests, at the end of the day, how they're scored or were previously scored is you get the sheet and then you have expert raters that then assess the final outcome. But now, I mean, with all sorts of digital technologies, you can get those fine-grained metrics. You can get log data from people's behavior and whatnot to look at not just the final product, but how did they get there? AI can be used, again, I say broadly AI, please forgive me if you are very against that broad term. It can be used in clustering of data to understand, for example, different types of player behavior. Automated scoring, so that's been a big push in the past year and a half also, maybe 2 years, from creativity researchers, is using what's called semantic distance. So if you look at the remote associates, so if you look at the alternative uses task where you're writing these different uses of an object, they use a method called semantic distance to evaluate the distance between words. So some words that are closely related and some are far related, to understand what's close to their originality score. And lastly, what I'm most interested and will address in many of my projects is this last one here, to help many people create more complex outputs. Big problem that you have is that the general public at large may not consider themselves to be very good at drawing or very good at creating something. And what generative AI really has the potential to do is to speed up that process that allows the public, anyone, to make a more complex output in a shorter period of time. So given all of these things, these reasons, why are we not using more games and AI to assess creativity? Well, I did a literature review on this to see, and we found that there were 11 games out there. This was back in 2022, and it was very scattered, the results, where these came from. Most of these games were developed and published as either working papers or in human-computer interaction conferences and venues. All except 2 had follow-up publications. So most of them were just one-off about a game, and then they throw around some concepts and creativity. The broad conclusions from it is that this nonverbal assessment for convergent thinking was really important because everyone was using this remote associates task. Aim to deliberately construct games exploring a span from simple and stylized to complex and real-life events. The biggest criticism of all of these tests is of these creative potential tests is how do they relate to real life? How does sitting there and writing the alternative uses relate to my my real life experiences? And so one way of getting at this is to create a suite of games which have both these simple and stylized interactions, as well as more domain-specific, complex activities, and to look at behavior between participants. So one thing that I've done in my research group is create a game-based portfolio for assessing creativity. I will quickly skim through this as I'm running out of time. It consists of 4 different games. I can go into the difference between games and gamification and whatnot if anyone is interested in that later. And the, here we have two, what we would call games on the left, and then two gamified tasks. Each of these games, Crea Tiles and Crea Blender, they provide a contextually homogeneous, which means very similar interaction framework for divergent thinking and convergent thinking, which is different. Normally they have these, quite different setups for tasks, but this, you can see it all looks like it fits together. And then they had divergent thinking tests, convergent thinking tests, and an open play task. And then we also have, here we chose to use a matrix abstract reasoning test. It's very close to the Raven, if you're familiar with it, and the alternative use tasks. We use the matrix abstract reasoning as a proxy for convergent thinking in this case, as it's much more visual. And our tasks that we developed were also much more visual, so it was a better comparison. But there is debate as to whether or not the rat should have been used as well for this convergent validity. So why these two processes, and how does it relate to AI? Well, the first task doesn't involve AI in the co-creation phase. It uses these 10 different tiles. So you see these little bricks here. And participants had tasks such as create as many different dog-like figures as possible in this. And then we had a generative AI task, this Crea Blender, where participants were given similar prompts. In this case, it was create as many different animal-like figures as possible using generative AI. And in this particular modality, or this particular project, it was using what's called a generative adversarial network. In that case, the modality was moving sliders to explore the space, the image space of what the possibilities were. Don't worry, I'll show you some more pictures there. So we were looking at behavior in these different areas. One that was very low dimensional. It was 36,000 possibilities. So not really small, but low dimensional compared to an image space. And just as an example here of what came from it in the tasks, I give you all 30 seconds here to, these are all participant responses. See how many different types of dogs you see. And then I'll show you here our clustering of them. So you had from sides, dog looking right. That was the most common. Just slightly less was from side looking left, front face, asymmetric, jumping, these different things. I also like this dog howling. I think at a point we also had dog peeing. And here, very specific, poodle and Doberman. So it's a bit fun to see the possibility space here that people could use, but also when it was contained enough that we could use an automated assessment for looking at their moves throughout the space, so their progress, as well as their final outcomes. In the Crea Blender version here, I just show an example of what it looks like with image blending. Here, the participants, this was the convergent phase. They were asked to select from these 3 original images or 3 starting images, which one created the final image, and then use these sliders. So these sliders were manipulating how much of a particular image to incorporate and then to generate the image. And they had the same task for the divergent thinking. We did, so first we did a pilot study, which is what I have described here. And then we did a study with 400 participants that played all 4 of these different games. The main reason why we did a pilot study for this Blender, first, it's the first assessment tool out there, so creativity assessment tool that uses a generative technology. So there are sorry, I just saw the question, got a little distracted. I'll send a link. They're freely accessible online, so I can share where and how to play the games. The important question here comes back to the process. So if this experience the human has with interacting with an algorithm is essentially just random, then it's not a creative process if they're just going back and forth, but they need to afford some level of control. And that's what we really looked at in the first study, and we did find that. I'm happy to share the paper going to reasons why we found that. But then we also saw that it elicits different types of behavior. So more explorative behavior in the phases that we want to see that, and more convergent behavior in the phases we wanted to see that. Again, happy to show plots and the data on that later. From the results from the 400 participant study, we had more than 2,000 images submitted, and participants used these 5 base images to create everything from snakes to it's a fun part of my research to, for example, be looking at all the different types of dogs that are created, or in this case, look at results. And this title, Underwear Otter, was one we came up with in the lab to try to describe what type of image this was. But everything from snakes to the underwear otter to polar bears, pigs, flying lizards, chickens, snails, whatnot. It was really interesting to look at the different patterns. This results, so we have one publication, a couple publications out on the tiles aspect, so the different squares, and our analysis for this is ongoing. So one thing that I would be remiss if I didn't comment on is that many of these papers that are saying that humans and algorithms, or algorithms are more creative than humans, is that the researchers are having generative models take standard creativity tests. And standard creativity tests, such as that alternative uses test, this one here just happens to be called the DAT, which is a divergent association task, quite similar, where you have words and you either have to say a word that's quite close to it or quite far away from it. And the results here, I mean, this is quite significant, saying that the responses on this particular test of using ChatGPT-4 is higher than 82.54% of the human responses. My personal opinion on these types of studies is that it's a benchmark, but it's really not all that interesting. I mean, we also have algorithms that can do all sorts of calculations much faster than us. And it's also not really the purpose of this type of task. The purpose of this type of task is to evaluate individual progress and individual potential, which you don't learn anything really new from by having a generative model take that particular task. Another aspect here, you see, just relating back to the big C or mini C or big C creativity, this type of AI taking the task or taking the test is much more this mini C area. And what people generally are concerned about with AI is more this pro C, so that's your job level, or big C, that would be that creative genius. We're thinking, oh my gosh, what's happening with AI there? And then this, so my question back to you is, when questioning whether AI can be considered creative, it's useful to consider the type, the level of creativity under question, from everyday creativity activities that are more amenable to machine automation, also maybe less relevant for us, whether or not it can do it, to paradigm shifting contributions that require higher level of human intervention. Okay, so I see now that I have gone through an hour and I'm only on my second project. So I will give myself 5 minutes for this and 5 minutes for the last one, very, very briefly, just so you get an idea. This second project was facilitating creative problem solving on complex socioscientific issues via AI-enhanced game-based portfolio, incorporating the concepts of citizen science, human-centered AI, or human-computer interaction, and participatory futures. And the goal of this was to take it out of typical psychology work and looking at how we can maybe address this issue that with the emergence of global societal dilemmas, large-scale public participation in formulation and implementation of local and global solutions, is important, but that agency to do such is waning, which poses a threat to democracy in the globe. No one fancy said this. I wrote this in a grant. I got the grant, so that was a nice thing. But this is the type of question I can say: how can we address big issues in society using human AI co-creativity? And this area draws on lots of different areas again, as I've said. And as a framework, I have been really impressed with this work that's described as human-computer interaction meets community citizen science. So using these technologies, new technologies, to connect research and social issues, empowering communities to produce scientific knowledge, etc. So I created this project. It's called CreaVisions. It's been around since 2020. We launched it, myself and the Center for Hybrid Intelligence launched it with AI for Good in 2020. And we have worked with municipalities, cities, conferences, universities, botanical gardens since then in Denmark, online, Italy, Paris, Denmark again, and then Belgrade in Serbia. And the premise of this project was to use AI generated imagery, this process similar to what we saw in Crea Blender, using these sliders, it may look familiar here, to empower anyone in the public to create images of their hopes and their dreams for the future. Big focus on this was to cater towards those who can't vote, specifically youth or residents that don't have residents of a location that don't have a possibility of communicating well their hopes and fears. So it's been a cool project. I've really enjoyed it. Again, it continues now, and this is the project that I'm working on in my fellowship. Some examples of what people have done. Here on the left, you have this was a student in Denmark. They wrote this really beautiful poem, What We Have Left, in conjunction with image that they created. The use case in Paris, for example, was specifically targeted towards problems and solutions. In that case, we had the participants generate first images of problems that they considered in their local community, and then go through an ideation phase on potential solutions to those problems. And then we did a series of events in Aarhus. Sorry for some of it, I think is in Danish here on the right side, where we had students create images of, again, either issues that they're facing or potential solutions. And you see here, this one is Seesawing University, commenting that we are missing physical workers such as carpenters. I think that's super interesting that young students were bringing that up, that we in the community are missing that. And then they can create a really interesting and potentially provocative image around it. And then here, the bottom one is House of LGBT plus in the future of Old Town. So we have an old part of the town. Here is highlighting how that area could potentially also be more oriented towards welcoming the LGBTQ plus community. One thing I want to mention here is that this was an experimentation with combining generative models, generative AI models, and modalities. In the first Crea Blender, you saw here also this sliders. So you are moving these sliders around and generating images. We, in the last two versions, the one in Paris and in Aarhus, have also combined this stable diffusion text-to-image functionality. And that's something that many of you have heard about. I haven't talked so much about. I'll try to now highlight a few points there. But it's really interesting now in the generative technology how you can combine these. So the generative one you may have heard of that was most common was this Dall-E. And it falls under the category of generative AI, but it's a different type of model than these GANs that I mentioned. So you have generative AI as a class, a broader field in artificial intelligence research. Then you have a diffusion model, which is a specific type of model. And then you have adaptations of that that each of these companies have put out, companies or universities, nonprofits, whatnot, like Dall-E 3, Stable Diffusion, and Firefly by Adobe. That's a recent one. And then you have the interfaces in which one interacts with those models. And so I know it can be kind of hard to understand the difference between, for example, GPT and ChatGPT, where you have one is the model, one is the interaction. But it's good to have an idea here that you have models or the algorithms, and then you have the interface in which you interact with those. With text to image, it's actually two models together. You have one that understands the text input. So that's essentially, yes, your text interpreter. You give it a command, make an astronaut flying on the moon, something like that. And then you have the other model, which creates the images. I won't go into more detail on that unless you want it. But a big question that then comes up here with these models is the concept of prompt engineering. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it became a huge trend last year and earlier this year. And it is also gaining a lot of research now. And in short, it's the process to have effective communication with AI for a desired result. And it's right now almost exclusively language-based. Here we go. So you would have this prompt, which it's also the same when you're interacting with ChatGPT, summarize text, give me a list of words, etc., goes to this model, and then you get an output. And how to create these prompts and how to understand these ways of interacting with generative AI through language is a huge area of research right now. I would just skip over these. I'm happy to share the slides at the end. And I'll show you here an example of how you can break down a prompt specifically with image generation. So here you have a format. Yes, I can elaborate on that question. Happy to, about elderly populations. I've also worked with elderly populations with Cray Visions. I'll tell you about that. So here you have the template. So you have a format, photograph, subject of a space whale, a solidifier, a whale in space. So that's repeating it, which gives more emphasis to the algorithm. So it knows, okay, that's an important part if you say it twice in two different ways. Perspective, style, in the style of Muka. A variant, control the soul, booster, trending on ArtStation. That's a place where people post many images. And then something you don't want, for example, no plants. So this is an overview of how important it is to understand the syntax of your prompt when you're engaging in these text to X scenarios. There are prompt books out there to help people do this. And text to X is not, so text to image is only one aspect. There's text to text like ChatGPT. There's also text to music, text to now also video, text to code. So that's been a big aspect as well. Okay, zooming through here. Limitations, these are not perfect. So if anyone says that you can always create a perfect image using these models, it's not true. There are limitations such as their ability to accurately represent complex concepts. Like this one here, the man paints a picture of himself. That's something that the model really has trouble with. Here, the man eats pizza, but the woman does not. The model also has a lot of trouble with complexity like that. I have sometimes ran into situations where the audience in talks is not completely clear that generative models are not search engines. So I just want to be really explicit here that unless there is a generative model incorporated into the search engine, a typical search engine like Google pulls up results from a broad search, whereas the generative model is using old material, so various types of data, be it text, image, etc., and creating something new from it. So they're not the same thing, and they don't operate in the same way. So how do you do research on this type of work? Well, in this case, for this project in Paris, we looked at problem identification. So how does using generative AI here help with identifying a particular problem? Problem identification and construction is one of the most important concepts in creative problem solving. It's also very understudied. And then also looked at the solution finding. So how using a type of generative AI, a visualization of using generative AI can help with the solution phase of the process. Again, if you're interested, go into the results here. I say in my 3 minutes now. The last case, to give an example of humans and experts, I am also collaborating with a company called Autodesk. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they make generative design software for architects in particular. And myself and the head of our center, the head of the Center for Hybrid Intelligence, have been working with two amazing researchers, Li and Yi, on a hybrid intelligence approach between human experts and AI-enhanced co-creative tools. We published a paper earlier this year, specifically on generative design. So it's using these generative models, that super class of models, to explore large design spaces and deliver high quality designs that balance multiple design objectives. That's a refresher on hybrid intelligence. We were looking at, in particular, how does this hybrid intelligence approach, so you think bringing the human more and more in the loop, also a process, not just the code, how does it help with a partnership with a generative design, a personal assistant? If you think about personal assistants in technology, I don't know how many of you are ages of who's out there, but if anyone remembers Clippy from Microsoft, their Word documents, that was a digital personalized assistant. It's come a long way now that we get to the ChatGPTs and integration of ChatGPT into different tools. And our question is really, I mean, how can we take this hybrid intelligence approach to generative design for a specific profession? And we looked particularly at a concept of technology acceptance, so ease of use and usefulness of the technology. And we developed our own model that took into consideration factors in artificial intelligence that are different from previous technologies, such as willingness to train. How willing would you be, hypothetically, if I said, if you work with this tool for 2 hours and you give it data and you train it, how willing are you to do that if I say it might help you in X process? It might help you in generating better layouts or better designs for something. So we looked at many different aspects here, both qualitative from their interaction data as well as qualitative from a Think Aloud interview. Yes. And again, we focused on an algorithmic aspect in interact. So what's the actual design of the algorithm underneath it, this particular generative design algorithm? What's the interaction? And then the deployment. How do you talk to someone about implementing the technology? This is briefly what it looked like, where participants were selecting different spaces within a generated layout and giving their intent, the intents. So did you like this? Yes, no, why? I like this room because it's close to archive room, it's close to bathroom, etc. And then the system was trained in each phase by the architect giving their intents. We looked at partnership, behavioral data, intents, trust in the systems, etc. And we, from that data, developed this model, which we in the future are hoping to both improve functionality of the tool at Autodesk, to integrate the generative assistant with existing workflows. That's a big question. validation using a control group. This was a model where it was one shot. All the participants tried the technology. So we should also use a control group. And then testing this hybrid intelligence technology acceptance model in different contexts. Okay, I powered through at the end. Any questions? Yes. We are going to the future. So let's see.
You do have a few questions in the Q&A, and I think one came through in the chat as well.
I see a couple here in the chat, actually.
Okay, yeah, maybe I see.
I'm not quite sure where to start.
Oh, yes, there are a few in the chat. So there are a few in the chat, and then a few came through in the Q&A.
Yes. Okay. So I'll just start with the Q&A. First, it seems they're all from Todd, someone named Todd. Hi, Todd. Thank you for your questions. I hope you enjoyed it. First question, I asked Dall-E 3 to create a company logo. It makes beautiful images, but spells the company's name wrong every single time. I even told it to focus on the name and still misspelled it. This is fascinating to me. Any thoughts? Yes, exactly. So the way that a diffusion model works, so it's trained, it takes images and then puts noise into the images. So you can imagine it a little bit like pixels. And then from that noise, then goes through a back process to create images again. And it uses, maybe I can go back to my my slide about the two different models. Here. Yeah, here. You have what's called clip, which is, well, maybe I have a better slide actually for this. I put in my appendix. Let me stop sharing briefly, see if I can get out to it. One moment. Here. I will try to share again. I just wanted to get out of my presentation mode so I could more easily scan through the slides. This description here should be in my extra. Yes. So here you can see briefly the process. So diffusion, it's a generative model that can be used for text to image synthesis. But here it takes sample from fixed distribution of images, goes through a diffusion or an incorporating noise process. And then you have something like this with lots of noise. And then when it's essentially called on by the clip model, so that's the other half of it that deals with the text, it will create an image as best as it can through that text interpreter or the clip model. And importantly, we're dealing with pixels and images. So it's doing its best to rearrange pixels and whatnot into something close, but it doesn't actually understand the text. It's not, it doesn't really understand what it's producing. So you will continue to face that problem. They are working on it, so some are a little bit better at it than others, but it is in the nature of the design of the image creation technology that it doesn't understand anything like text in the creation phase. It's focused on putting together an image based on metadata from previous images and whatnot that aggregates it together. So, second question here: have you played with OpenAI's GPTs yet? Yet also called agents. OpenAI's GPTs. I have to look at the link to know explicitly what you're talking about. Maybe it is, I see it's new. Okay, November 7th. Yes. this is likely, I don't know if you want me to answer the question. Yes, or if there's an answer to it, yes, I have seen it. It's based on some research that first came out of Stanford and is really hitting now to be one of the main waves of interest, because it's sort of various different models or agents that can be spawned to do different things. It's sort of similar to work if you have heard of AutoGPT or Baby AGI, which really gets into also task decomposition. So one model spawning other models, some same or different agents, that can break down a task. Actually, one of the most prominent examples was pizza ordering. There's a funny video, I don't have it now, but I can share it, about how an AI can actually then break down a task like ordering pizza and then create different models to do different things, or different agents to do different things, not models in that case. It is a growing research now. I believe this is one of the main factors that some research say now, okay, we have 1,000 days until we might reach the beginning of AGI, based on some of this research, which again originally came from Stanford. Last question. What do you think of this one from Todd? What impact do you think will the impact of Microsoft's Copilot, OpenAI powered tools in Windows and Office? It seems like a sea change to getting non-early adopters involved. So I think that this will really depend on how well the tool has been integrated, and how well generative AI has been integrated, and what type of interaction it is. So not just the algorithms, but the type of interaction, and the type of discussion about the tool. And I bring up this slide here that I skimmed over. This was specifically with generative design. If you Google generative design, this for a long time was one of the most popular hits. And it says why generative design is doomed to fail. Generative design doesn't work because you're on the hook for generating options. Quantity doesn't substitute for quality. Comparing options is harder than it looks. What you can measure isn't what matters. Designers don't work like this. No one else works like this. So I think it's going to be a big question about whether the way it's been integrated is understandable, acceptable to users in a way that doesn't disrupt their current workflows. In a different study that I have been doing with one of my master's students, we were looking at creative writing, not using ChatGPT, but using a different tool. It's called pseudo-write. This was specifically with amateur creative writers. And many of them comment on how the AI, the model that they're using, is cool, but it's also distracting. So it's interesting for them to use, but then they get off topic. Another aspect, I have a different study working with entrepreneurship students, entrepreneurial students. And a big problem we face with them using various types of generative models in the process is that they use, in particular, chat features like ChatGPT and Bard and whatnot, more or less as a yes man. So you have an idea, and then you use ChatGPT to confirm that idea. And as long as your idea isn't factually incorrect, then ChatGPT is designed to encourage you. And that's what you might call, or what is called in the literature, a pleasing agent. So one that the responses are similar to yours, and is generally encouraging, as long as something, again, isn't factually incorrect, versus a provoking agent. So an agent that actually stimulates you to think in different directions. And this is unless it's prompted. Of course, you can go into ChatGPT or other models and say explicitly, please be adversarial, or please be highly critical of this. Under normal circumstances, it won't question. And okay, in the case of entrepreneurship, confidence and then overconfidence is a big issue in whether or not you actually go through with your idea. And sometimes it can be good to boost confidence, but in many cases, it can be problematic. Again, in the creative writing situation, there were many writers who commented also that they discussed their idea with ChatGPT and or other systems, and then they started to and ChatGPT was supportive, and they started to go down the road with a particular path for their writing, and then midway, when they get peer feedback, they realize, okay, this was actually a really crappy idea I invested my time in. So it's also a question of whether or not, for example, these systems will be yes men to a person in their work, or whether or not it will actually enhance different aspects of the project or of their idea. Okay, lots of questions now. I see here CreaVisions, a couple CreaVisions questions. I will just say very broadly that our tools are available online. I am happy to share links to them. I'm a little pressed right now trying to answer the questions, but perhaps I can send them to Kristen and others. Also happy to share the slides so that you can look at them. I also feel free to email me if you have specific questions about them. We're also, myself and my center is quite open to collaborations. If you have questions or are interested in this area, happy to discuss more. Question about how AI and hybrid intelligence may be applied to elderly populations to enhance an aging individual's long-term creative contribution to challenges faced by society and or their engagement in day-to-day living. So this is a great question. I really like it. And I am, it is definitely part of my research agenda. In the CreaVisions project, specifically in the Venice iteration of it. Myself primarily, but at the center of the team worked with a conference called Creativity Cognition, and the host chairs or the location chair for that, Neil Maiden, he and his wife live in Venice. And one of the motivations for developing this version of CreaVisions was that Venice is a unique city with the fact that the Biennale, this big art exhibition, comes to it every 2 years, and it involves many artists and practitioners from lots of other countries coming and creating things in Venice. And then many tourists, of course, it has lots of tourists, but many tourists coming in to see those. And many have lots of perspectives on the city and what it should be like. But our specific purpose was to engage the locals, so Venetians, those who've lived there or residing there, in this discussion about their own city. And we, in particular, partnered with several groups that catered to elderly Venetians. I was very stressed when I was told the day before my first workshop there that most of the population had most of the people in the group didn't have cell phones or Wi-Fi. So I was coming in with these tablets and computers, trying to demonstrate human AI co-creativity, and thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to go terribly. But it was actually such a rewarding experience, where the sort of elderly population was so engaged at being able to visualize and create something and then start a discussion around a topic that they were concerned about. And then we did an exhibition of the results there. So they also then had their work exhibited alongside the Biennale as a discussion point. And we found that so that was using a version that was just slider based. but this type of modality was extremely accessible regardless of language. Many of them didn't speak English so well. We had, of course, Italian collaborators, but they didn't need to put language to it. They could just manipulate the images. And we're very happy with that experience. And so I'm personally very interested in continuing with that type of participant setup. Okay, let's see, can Cray Visions currently be used in teaching learning environments at universities to support expressions of professional creative goals, or is it exclusively focused on your team's research? Patricia, I'm not entirely sure what you mean by this question. I should say that Cray Visions is publicly available. We continue to develop it and create new versions of it. We are working on a whole, what we call a Cray Visions universe. The fellowship that I'm on now, actually at our Institute for Advanced Studies, is focused on sort of this triangle of communication between the general public, between researchers, and between what you would call decision makers, so government, nonprofits, whatnot, and specifically focused on how research can be communicated in visual means for societal impact. So how can one communicate how their maybe fundamental research, as I said, my background is in physics. I know it can be very hard to communicate impact of research, of that type of research at a societal level, but looking at how different types of generative technology, specifically image generation, but also the creator in dialogues with various generative models, can create something to support a dialogue between the public and also the stakeholders. So we have many different ideas for how this Cray Visions project can be used, and are open to ideas or thoughts. So I would just ask if you could maybe follow up with me. I'll put my my email in the chat, and I welcome questions or comments that maybe I haven't been able to. Oh, I put that just direct, but I'll send that
In
to.
addition to that, we will share out any resources that were mentioned today, as well as her contact information. And we have a quick survey if you guys wouldn't mind filling that out, as well as some follow-up information about the Research Commons.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Janet, for this presentation. This was fantastic. We really appreciate you joining us to present today. If you have, so a couple of times I know, Janet, you mentioned that people could email you with questions and that you also would provide some additional information. So if you wouldn't mind sending those things to us, we will send them out to all of the all of the attendees so that they have that information.
Perfect. I will send the slides as well as the links to the games and different interactions that we have.